Hello, so this is part 3 of my past paper walkthrough for Edexcel A Level History, Civil Rights in the USA 1850 to 2009. This is the final one where I'm looking at section C, which are the breadth questions. And again, in the exam, obviously you just have to do one of these, and I'm going to do both of them just to show how I would kind of approach these. So before we get into this, there's a really, really important point that you need to know about section C of paper 3 and these breadth questions. In order to get to level 5, and when examiners are marking these, they will look at this, you need to cover 75% of the period in question. So if we look at the dates here, 1850 to 2009, that's 159 years, okay? So 75% of 159, I've just done this on the calculator, is 119.25, so pretty much 120 years. So if you're doing this paper, when you're planning your question, have I covered more than 120 years? Now, whether the examiner will precisely look for this, I'm not sure. I think it maybe depends on the examiner. But what I would say to play it safe is try and do this. And if you cover over 100 years, you're probably going to be okay. But obviously, if you can cover more than that, that's better. So play it, always kind of play it safe. So that guidance over, let's get stuck into these questions. So the first question, question 7, is the question on topic 6, which is about the change in geography. And the question is this: the inner city riots in what in 1965 were the most damaging obstacle to desegregation in the USA in the years 1850 to 2009? So I'll talk about this question in a second, but let's just kind of go through it as we would as normal. So the inner city riots in what? So that's the factor. And it's saying, are they the most damaging obstacle to desegregation in the USA? So we're talking about obstacles to desegregation, things that stood in the way of desegregation. Now, I'm just going to have a mini rant here for a second about this question. I think this question is really not very good. I think that the idea that the riots in what were an obstacle to desegregation, that you could even potentially argue that they were more important than Jim Crow laws or the KKK or riots in the Red Summer or Tulsa, I think is almost offensive. So I'm going to go along with this and kind of plan out this question as I would if I was in the exam. But I do think this is a pretty problematic question, and I don't think any historian would argue that over this period you could ever argue that the Watts riots were the most damaging obstacle to desegregation. I mean, we're talking about this is a period in which slavery existed. I just think that's insensitive, to put it mildly. Anyway, rant over. So question 7. If you're going to argue, paragraph 1, we're going to talk about the Watts riots. So how could we argue that the Watts riots were an obstacle to desegregation? And I've looked at the mark scheme here, and what the exam board are kind of looking for is that this idea that Watts was a turning point. Okay, it was a turning point because it was post 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it really highlighted that socio-economic issues were kind of most prominent. It wasn't that the focus of the Black American movement, particularly in the North, wasn't kind of desegregation. It was socio-economic issues. This is a riot in a kind of Black American area. Also, it leads to white Americans, kind of a lot of kind of liberal whites saying, civil rights have gone far enough. And this leads to, the Republicans, taking office, and you could talk about, the election of Nixon, for example, in 1968 with the Southern strategy. And this idea that civil rights have gone far enough, there wasn't any powerful civil rights legislation after what you had the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which was pretty kind of toothless. Also, in a paragraph on what you could say that this was down to kind of white flight and kind of the growth of kind of ghettos, and it's a symptom of those issues. Okay, however, I think it's pretty clear to see that the most significant cause obstacle to desegregation was actually was other things. Okay, sorry, let me just try and get this formatting correct here. So the other thing, I'll just leave it like that. So the other thing that we could talk about, paragraph 2, could be obviously Jim Crow. Okay, so Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction. Okay, and I would talk about the Plessy case and say that this is more of an obstacle to desegregation. Okay, the 1883 civil rights cases, which declared that the 1875 Civil Rights Act was deemed unconstitutional. Okay, so those things, I would argue that the Supreme Court decisions which opened the door to Jim Crow or gave the green light to Jim Crow really were that's the most prominent obstacle, I would argue, throughout this period. Okay, most prominent obstacle to desegregation, because this paves the way, this sets the precedent, until 1960, 64. I mean, maybe you could talk about the 50s with the Brown decision, but it really does kind of set a precedent. In this paragraph, you could also discuss kind of the KKK, and you could also discuss maybe lynching. You're talking about the late 19th century. Yeah, and I would argue, my argument here would be that those things were the most damaging obstacle to desegregation, because they set a precedent, for almost 100 years. Okay, the Watts riots, things had happened then. Yes, socioeconomic issues were an issue, and it was, you could argue it was a turning point in the movement. It was a turning point for maybe for kind of whites as well, that this idea that civil rights has gone far enough. But I don't think you could possibly argue that what's a more important obstacle to desegregation than Jim Crow laws. I think that would be a little bit absurd. So paragraph 3, I think you could also talk about, so almost adding on to the Jim Crow laws paragraph, so it's similar. I think you're talking about the kind of white backlash after the Great Migration. Okay, so, and you could talk about the development of Harlem in the 1920s, but then you can also talk about the backlash to the Great Migration. You could talk about the Red Summer of 1919, and specifically, if you want to be specific, you could talk about Chicago. You could also talk about Tulsa Massacre in 1921. Okay, and you could say that this was an obstacle to desegregation, because when white Americans, when Black Americans moved to the North, they faced this great hostility. Okay, so I'm looking at this, and have we covered? If we look at the evidence here, have we covered all the period? Maybe not. So perhaps what you could do in this paragraph, you could say, this idea that highlighted that socioeconomic issues most prominent. You could say this continued, and throughout the period, and you can maybe talk about something like the 1992 LA riots. Yeah. So that give you over 100 years. It does, if we think we've talked about the 1875 Civil Rights Act, we've almost got 120 years there. So you could maybe have a think, maybe there's something else. I mean, post-Reconstruction, you could potentially talk about something that happened in Reconstruction. But that's what I would argue. That's my approach to that question, that I'd do 3 paragraphs, Watts riots, and how that could be considered an obstacle, then Jim Crow laws, and then the white backlash after the Great Migration. That's what I would talk about there in that essay. Okay, now on to question 8, which is a much less controversial question. So how far is the publication of To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960, the key turning point in the shaping of white attitudes towards race relations in the United States in the years 1850 to 2009. So I'm assuming with this one, because it says the publication of To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm assuming it's talking about literature only. It doesn't say kind of like film, TV, and literature. So I'm just going to focus on literature here. And if you look at the mark scheme, I think it is just literature that's mentioned. So, I would actually argue, so we're talking about something that's a key turning point in the shaping of white attitude. So what does it mean by turning point? So we're going to need to define turning point. The same way, in question 7, you might define the most damaging obstacle. Obstacle is something that stands in the way, something that slows down this process. So a turning point is something that leads to kind of widespread, you could say unprecedented, long-term change. That's just something I've kind of come up with right now, but I think that would probably work. Okay, so is To Kill a Mockingbird the most significant turning point? I'm going to argue, for the sake of argument here, that it's that's not allowing me to format that. That's okay. I'm going to argue that it's actually Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to say it's actually Uncle Tom's Cabin. It led to it was more kind of unprecedented and widespread impact than To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, so paragraph 1 on To Kill a Mockingbird. So To Kill a Mockingbird, yes, it did have an impact on white attitudes towards race relations. You could say that it was part of this change in the 1950s and 60s, and you could talk about the civil rights movement. You can maybe even talk about other kind of films of the time. Perhaps you could bring in something else from topic 7. For example, you could talk about In the Heat of the Night, perhaps. You could, and it's really important with this topic, by the way, with topic 7, to bring in own knowledge. So not just knowledge about the book, what's going on in the book, or the work, I should say, but what's going on. So I would mention the Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, I Have a Dream speech, and this change in white attitudes, support, if you think about the March on Washington, there were white people there, so you could talk about that. So that would be my main argument for To Kill a Mockingbird, that it was part of a change in attitudes, but it wasn't as important as Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was kind of unprecedented. Okay, so then I'd go to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I would say that this had a kind of, as I say, a widespread impact. It was abolitionist. And you could use the quote from Lincoln, you're the little lady that started this great war. It led to growth of abolitionist movement, and had this big impact on race relations. Much more sympathetic. But then, as a kind of counterpoint, you could say it was quite paternalistic. It was perhaps the characters are quite one-dimensional and things like that. So you could do a kind of counterpoint there. But the question isn't about positive white attitudes. So, it's however things are changing. Then I would go into, I'd probably talk about Gone with the Wind. And I would say that this is a kind of continuation of, this, it's kind of quite a romantic view of kind of slavery in the South. Yeah. And that it didn't really change. It was kind of limited, change in terms of a turning point, more of a continuation. And then if you had time to do a fourth paragraph, I would talk about Beloved, which gives it's the only, and I'd really emphasize this, it's the only work that really gives the Black American perspective and shows how attitudes have changed since changed by the 1980s. Okay, so then we are getting all of the coverage. So we've got Uncle Tom's Cabin, in the 19th century, right the way to Beloved at the end of the 20th century. But I would argue, as I said, for this one, I think Uncle Tom's Cabin is the most significant in shaping white attitudes towards race relations. Okay, I hope that was useful. Any questions or comments, please leave a comment below. Thank you for listening.